Hello, students. I may not be here, but you still have to hear my voice. So I'm going to finish up the lecture for you so that you have this in preparation for your exam on Friday. All right, so the bell cruelly cut us off, separated us, as we were talking about coercive federalism, which is a type of federalism that arose in the 1970s and continues through to today. So coercive, as you can tell from the name, is forced federalism. Coercive acts from the British. Anybody remember that? Okay, little throwback there to what the British were up to in Revolutionary War times, well, prior to Revolutionary War. So, what led us to coercive federalism? Well, we felt that there was a need for a stronger national government. So, things that lead people to believe that we need a stronger national government tend to come during times of crises and times of war. They also come about when it's seen that states are violating people's civil rights. So, people look to the federal government to protect them from states violating their rights. So, you can probably think of a number of crises and or war that have happened since the 1970s that would lead to this, and also a number of civil rights violations, although some of those were dealt with in the 1960s that sort of set the groundwork for the coercive federalism that we see. So go ahead and think about those, name those in your head. If you're not sure, ask a neighbor. So coercive federalism shifts power towards the national government. The goal is to get states to line up with federal policy priorities. So the federal government is like, we're leading the way, and we're going to get everybody else to fall in line because we're the federal government. So you can see sort of the groundwork laid in some of the civil rights acts. For example, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that gives the government power over states that have historically been violating civil rights, that they're allowed to enforce civil rights laws in those states. The Voting Rights Act that guarantees the right to vote to African Americans that had so long been denied to them in various ways. Federal officials are allowed to go in and register people to vote, and elections were historically a prerogative of the states, not of the federal government. But they misbehaved, so they had to have federal monitoring. Other acts that you guys may have heard of, the Motor Voter Act, whereby all states must offer people the ability to register to vote when they get their driver's license. The Americans with Disabilities Act, the Clean Air Act, all of those impose certain federal ideals on states. States sometimes are like, yeah, we'll go along with this, and sometimes they're really upset because they get what's basically an unfunded mandate, which they don't like. And I'll talk a little bit more about unfunded mandates later. Bush and Obama both sort of went along with coercive federalism in their presidencies. So Bush passed education legislation, No Child Left Behind, that mandated more testing in schools if schools wanted federal funding. Obama has an Education Act. He also has the domestic stimulus package that he puts into place. And of course, Obamacare, which really expanded the reach of the federal government. Finally, in terms of coercive federalism, there are federal preemptions. So there's the supremacy clause in the Constitution, which says that the Constitution and any federal laws trump state or local laws. And so laws that the federal government creates can basically invalidate state and local laws. And that's what happens with preemption. So if the federal government creates a law saying that they get to regulate, let's say, some sort of food product, so they get to regulate milk. If states have laws that regulate milk, the federal law might trump those state laws, might basically invalidate them, and that would be preemption. So the states have been fighting back against coercive federalism, and they've been able to get the courts on their side somewhat. And so that leads us to balanced federalism, which really has been the story of the last 20 years, that we have all these different versions of federalism kind of mixing together. So you can see elements of all the ones we've talked about, coercive and cooperative and dual and picket fence, right? So all of those together are sort of balanced federalism, where the states have been able to regain sort of some of the power, and they've been leading in policy initiatives in many areas. So states have been the innovators, and they've done this in both progressive and conservative causes. If you think about Kansas, they tried to implement conservative views on taxes and like really slash their tax rate and did an experiment in that. It did not end well, spoiler alert. So they've backtracked from that some. California, of course, is generally innovating in the environment. They have all kinds of environmental legislation that's much more strict than the rest of the country. So what this leads to sometimes then is competitive federalism, where states compete with each other in terms of programs that they offer or maybe benefits that they offer. Supporters of this say competitive federalism is good because it leads to innovation and states can compete for citizens and dollars with their policy initiatives. Critics of competitive federalism say actually it can be kind of a race to the bottom. So states, maybe cut taxes in an attempt to lure business, but then have no money to put into schools. Maybe they try to outlaw unions and wages go down, or things along those lines. So you have people who say, yes, this is really good. It's great to have like mini laboratories where you can try out policies across the country. And other people say, no, this actually can be harmful to citizens. The picture here is a raid by the Drug Enforcement Agency against a marijuana dispensary. So, right, the state had legalized marijuana, policy innovation, but then the federal government said, no, it's still outlawed. So you have some tricky things being navigated here in federalism. Fiscal federalism refers to how money flows between the state and the federal government, really federal government giving to states. So you have things called categorical grants. So these are granted within a category. States get this money, but there's strings attached. The federal government says you have to use this money in a particular way. So they're more restrictive than block grants. So block grants are it's like a block of money given to states, and they get to spend it how they see fit as long as it's within a certain policy area. So they differ from categorical grants in that categorical grants will say we have to, it's in this policy area, but in this particular program. So I think your book gives the example of like in education, but you have to spend it on a school lunch program would be an example of a categorical grant, whereas a block grant would just be this is money for education and the states could decide how they wanted to spend it on education. So this allows them to spend along with their priorities as they see fit. Excuse me. So with any money that's given to states, the federal government, well, Congress, I should say, usually likes to kind of tell the states what they need to do. You get Republicans generally arguing more for block grants than Democrats do. But even for some things, Republicans are like, no, let's have some conditions of aid on there. We already learned about the highway system and how we got the drinking age to 21. That would be a condition of aid, right? And then there's things that are called mandates. So Congress may make a rule and they say, look, states, you have to comply with this rule. It may or may not have anything to do with money. States hate mandates that cost money, but that they don't get any money for, and that's called an unfunded mandate. And so the Americans with Disabilities Act falls under this, and states dislike this because they simply don't have the resources that the federal government has. So it can be a real problem for them to comply with the law, even though in general, people in the states say, yeah, we support this law, but they may not support having to pay for the law. Okay, so we talked about categorical grants, and they can fall under project grants. Excuse me, states compete for those. Ohio actually competed for a transportation one back at the beginning of the Obama administration. It was for putting in high-speed rail, and they won, but Governor Kasich turned down the money because he said the project was just simply not an efficient use of funds. So I think a different state ended up with the money, and I actually meant to go back and check and see what happened. Did they develop their projects or not? But I I'm just realizing now I never did that, so that'll be fun to find out. And then there's formula grants, and so anyone who qualifies based on the formula then would receive that money. And so um, states would then have to spend that money on anyone who falls below the poverty level. And a lot of times, these types of grants require matching funds. And so the formula ones can be difficult if they underestimate how many people are going to qualify for that grant. Then there's this thing called revenue sharing, where states can get money from the federal government and it doesn't require matching funds, and they can just be like, spend it on anything government. Yay, go nuts. So all of these things have been used at different times as federal government priorities have shifted, state priorities have shifted, and just depending on what um, what states need and what society needs. So as needs in society have changed and views have changed, so has the funding um, and the distribution of power between the state and federal governments. And you can sort of see this in kind of which party's in power and what the mood of the public is. So sometimes politicians use mandates when they can't, raise taxes to give money to certain things, and other times politics mandates that they use something more like a block grant or a categorical grant to give money to states. Democrats tend not to like block grants for things like Medicaid and other social safety net programs because they feel that conservative states will try and implement things like work requirements or drug testing and things, and they're not fans of that. Okay, let's look at a couple court cases that are involved with federalism. So you've got McCulloch versus Maryland. This is one of those Marshall cases. For whatever reason, John Marshall gets involved in a lot of M cases, right? So like Marbury versus Madison, decided by John Marshall, and McCulloch versus Maryland, decided by John Marshall. Well, obviously he didn't decide all of it. He was with a whole court. And the question here is, could Congress charter a national bank? And the decision that the court reaches is yes, even though the power isn't explicitly stated in the Constitution. So Congress creates this national bank. Maryland tries to tax the bank out of existence. There's some lawsuits. It gets to the court. And basically, Marshall talks about the implied powers of Congress, and the implied powers come from their enumerated powers in the Constitution that say they have the power to tax and the power to coin money, so therefore they have the power to create a bank, even though it doesn't specifically say in the Constitution, yes, Congress may create a bank. So he decides it on that basis. And could the states tax the national bank? No, because the power to tax is the power to destroy, says John Marshall in his opinion. So this was a case that elevated national federal power over state power and solidified that federal law trumped state law. So he's relying on the supremacy clause in this decision. There's a cute little, piggy bank. Hey, what if our national bank was a piggy bank? Huh? What do you think? Okay, I'll move on. So what's left of state power? Well, actually, states have kind of been having a little bit of a resurgence. The 10th Amendment has sort of come back into fashion here and has been cited by the court. So states' rights are sort of having a resurgence these days. So there's the United States versus Lopez, where a kid in Texas takes a gun to school, and he's charged with a federal crime, even though it was also against Texas law to take a gun into school. There was the Gun-Free School Zones Act, and Congress had created this act based on the Commerce Clause, so their power to regulate interstate commerce. And the Supreme Court said, yeah, no, you that was a stretch. Okay, carrying a gun to school has nothing to do with commerce. You weren't able to make this law, so they strike it down. And so that kind of set the basis for more states' rights cases that would challenge laws that Congress had made, based on specific clauses of the Constitution or the 10th Amendment. They would bring these cases before the Supreme Court and have enjoyed success in some cases and not in others. So, federalism in the last 20 years, we've got competitive federalism and balanced federalism. States' rights being claimed by both Democrats and Republicans, depending on who's president, really, and what executive orders they've issued. And so states' attorneys general will challenge based on if they're conservative or liberal and who's in the presidential office. So these cases about states' rights keep coming up before the courts. And the courts have decided both ways. So it's not really possible to say, like, it's always the liberal side that wins or always the conservative side that wins. There have been fairly evenly split court decisions in terms of states' rights and the issues that they've brought up. And the national government wins a lot of cases too. In all of this, we do need to keep in mind that federalism as a system was created to protect the rights of the individual. And so the idea, again, is to disperse power, to have many points where citizens can interact with the governmental power, to inject into their ideas into the policy process, to be heard by their representatives, but also to keep power diffuse so that the government cannot become tyrannical and abusive of people's rights. Again, looking at the reasoning in Federalist 10 and Federalist 51. So while we talk about all these different types of federalism and kind of the power struggle between the state and the state governments and the federal government, do keep in mind that the individual was sort of what is at the heart of the creation of federalism in the first place. And that, friends, is federalism. Thank you.